What's up, man?
How are you, Jason?
Oh my gosh, man. This is pretty cool.
Well, hold on. Let me try to get this phone set up. There we go. Okay.
Yeah, man.
I'm I'm at the Satori offices today, so I didn't bring my laptop. But
Yeah,
no,
when did you start Satori?
it's a long, long story. But I knew that I wanted to exit out of the gyms and the whole fitness industry at age 60 because 42 years was enough. I mean, I felt like my resume was pretty good. I'd accomplished everything I had set out to accomplish, and I was just ready. And so I had actually invested in Satori, and so did my brother. But Randy Eisman, who's one of the co-founders, is actually here today. I had known Randy since he was 24 years old. He's 48 now, and just always loved and respected him. And so I came in, gosh, about 9, 10 years ago. He had asked me just to come in to kick off their Optimal Living, which is a program that's still active today. And just then he basically paid my wife and I to come here once a month to each office, once in Fort Worth and Dallas, uh, for me to do one-on-ones, and for my wife Brenda to do meditation. They even built her a meditation room. And through that, I just started making a lot of introductions just because I believe in these guys and I love their platform. And I also was a testimonial. And one day Randy comes up to me. He goes, Larry, we have a good problem. I said, what's that? He goes, You're you've never even asked about these amazing connections you've made for us, but you've raised close to $100 million. He goes, but you're not licensed, so we can't pay you what we would normally pay someone that would raise a significant amount of money like that. So I said, what do I need to do? And he told, so I spent a year, Jason, just figuring out how I could get out of taking those exams and still get paid.
Right.
Finally, finally, I just took 3 of those exams, and to my COVID actually worked out really well because I've had a lot of time to study. I passed the exams. I got a wonderful broker dealer out of Houston because they're an advisory firm, not a broker dealer. And the same week that I got my license was the same week I got my first private equity deal funded.
Mm.
And so it was like a really just so gratifying and rewarding. And the space is easy for me because, as you know, and I can tell just from just our correspondence, our brief connection, that you are a people person and it's all about relationships. So that just sort of having had my business in Highland Park for so long, and being in this young president's organization for so long, and a founding member of Dallas Nationals, and just the list goes on. Plus, I'd like to think just being on radio for all those years that people got a chance to know me. I was the same person that was on the radio, and
Right.
so as you also know, because you're in the same type of field, it's about authenticity. It's about trust, and
Right.
trustworthy people can really do well in this industry. And so that's where I'm at.
It's really funny because it's something that I talk to. I was an angel investor for a long time, and so I spent a lot of years talking to entrepreneurs and looked at a lot of business plans, thousands of business plans. And so, whenever somebody comes to you and, especially like after I started writing books and people come to you and they say silly stuff, right, Larry? They say stuff like, "Oh, teach me how to make $1 million." And I'm like, "Okay, we start tomorrow." And it's funny because how many people actually follow through and call you back? And so everybody wants something significant in their life, but it's the want and it's the desire and the very moment that a lot of people, um, once we find out the shit that it takes in order to accomplish whatever it is, then people just immediately give up and they go back to what they were doing. And so, like you said, like, to me, trust is it's the opposite of obscurity, right? Like, uh, entrepreneurs come to me and they say, "Oh, I have this thing. I'm living on my mom's couch and I have this idea that's going to make hundreds of millions of dollars." But who are you? And what have you done before? What have you followed through on? What tangible thing is out there in this world that I can look up and see that you have accomplished that would lead me to believe that you can build this $100 million thing? And so, and you appreciate, like back when I was a trainer, I became a trainer and I immediately knew that I was bottlenecked by being a trainer in my time. So then I started group training people and having a lot of people meet me at once. And then I started educating. I turned my personal training company into a nonprofit and then began teaching. I ultimately helped like 500 people lose 9,000 pounds in this case study, Larry. But the only reason why I was able to do it is because I wasn't acting as a personal trainer. I built a relationship with these people as a coach, someone they could rely on, someone they could trust, someone they could believe in. And that was the start of something like 12 years ago. But that 12 years has left a consistent footprint of trust online for everybody to see, in your gym for everybody to see for the last 40 years. I've been talking about you for the last 24 hours, Larry, because everybody in Dallas that's my business partner, everybody that's invested in, they all know who you are. You've done a lot. And so whenever I hear people say, "Oh, Jason, I want to build this $1 million thing," brother, most people don't even begin to understand the amount of time and work and infrastructure, blood, sweat, tears, sacrifice. Like it's not just about building the relationship, it's about who you've become, man. And that's who they want to build the relationship with. And
Right.
that's exceptional, Larry. Like I think it's fast. I'm sitting here talking to you and you're 62 years old. By the time my mom was 62, like she had given up on everything, and by the time she's 67, she's gone.
Wow.
Like
Sorry
when
about
you're
that.
67, you're going to be like at the gym, like
Oh,
still doing your thing, still out
well,
here changing lives.
take me back a little bit further. Where did you grow up? Where did you go to high school? What was the biggest turning point for you uh, outside of the fitness business?
Yeah, I grew up in Garland. Um, it's really fun. I started working at Subway when I was 15, and we gave all the Garland cops free food, and so I started building a relationship with police officers at a very young age. And then whenever I was 18, I was working at this oil change place. Met a bunch of cops that were directing traffic out at Preston and Frankfurt, that bank right in front of
I,
the Valve Lane.
I lived right around the corner.
Yeah,
I lived in far north Dallas. I literally
so you probably
walked.
knew Cabby and David Ruiz and Mike Potter and all
No,
those guys that were out there in that intersection for 20 years.
I
Eh,
I don't know if I did or not, but I'll tell you this: that was literally, if someone said, "Where do you live?" I would say either Campbell, Preston, or Frankfurt and Preston. That I
right.
know that area very
Yeah,
well.
that place was hopping. And so one of the cops owned a pool company, and I started working with him. Um, and then I eventually started my own pool company, but I mean, yeah, I mean, we had, one of my very first pool routes on my very first day was in Highland Park, right over off of Mockingbird and like, I mean, we had a lot over in the Davenport area. We had a whole lot of houses over there. And so I used to drive past your gym all the time, man. And then I was a little bit different. So I grew up listening to talk radio. I was never a music person.
I was the
Um,
same way.
yeah, so, by the time I was a teenager, I was listening to, Howard Stern and Russ Martin and then a lot of guys on the web. I listened to Bob Proctor, Les Brown, all these different guys.
I
And
knew
they were
that
kind of my
well.
fathers growing up. So
Well, did I ever? Did you know how I got into radio?
no, man, how?
I'll tell you the Reader's Digest story. So
Yeah,
I, like you, I didn't like listening to music. I like listening to talk radio. So back in the
right,
'80s, a little bit before your time, KLIF was the talk radio leader, and Norm Hitzkiss, a guy named David Gold, who was sort of the right wing Republican show host, Kevin McCarthy, Bob Ray Sanders, who was to the left. They had this incredible lineup, and I listened all the time. And Norm Hitzkiss, do you know who you know Norm, right?
Yes. Hmm.
Norm was into sports, but he was into horse racing. He was into gambling. So I thought, I'm going to train this guy, um, because maybe I'll get some good mentions. It'll help my personal training business. And I called and left message after message after message. And finally, one day, Norm answers the phone at his office. After dozens of tries, he didn't even let me finish. He goes, "I'll do it. I'll take your offer up. I'll have you train me," because he always had a weight problem. What he didn't know is that my dad was a degenerate compulsive gambler, and I was raised at the racetrack. So I knew a fair amount of horse racing, probably as much as he did. And he was just so fascinated with my knowledge of horse racing just through growing up at the racetrack. We became friends. And then one day, I just unannounced went into the headquarters to talk to the program director, who was a guy named Dan Bennett, who's now a pretty big executive for one of the big radio firms. And I basically pitched my story to him, and he says, "That's my idea." I said, "Excuse me." He goes, "That's my idea. I just called Ken." He goes, "I just called Dr. Ken Cooper to do a weekend show, and he turned me down. Said he's too busy. Said, write your name and number down." And the next week, I was a guest on the David Gold show as a guest. And of course, we lit up the phone lines. I had a natural aptitude for this. I knew that I did. And then the week after, he says, I checked, we had voicemail back then. I checked my voicemail. He goes, "Larry," he goes, "I've got good news and bad news. The good news is we're going to start you off. You're going to be the host of the weekend workout. The bad news is the only time slot I have is 7 a.m. on Sundays," which is like, that's the deadest spot on
Right.
radio you
Right.
ever have. But I took that spot, and it didn't take long for them to shove me into what would be like prime time weekends, which was 10 to 12 Saturday and Sunday. The show was a cash cow for them. I was on remote constantly. And then in my Highland Park gym, a guy named Spence Kendrick had an idea to do Sports Radio 1310 The Ticket. I trained with Skip Bayless at the time. Skip's been a beloved friend all these years. And I introduced him to Skip. And then Sports Radio 1310 is created. And so out of reciprocity, they tried to get me to come over there. And weekend hosts don't get a contract. They gave me a 3-year contract. They sweetened this deal so nicely that I told I couldn't turn it down. And I went to KLIF, and I announced to them, to Dan Bennett and the GM, Dan Halliburton. They were so angry. They were so pissed off. They're like, "That station will never last. It's on a bad free," like we gave you your start, bullshit. And it's
Right.
like, I appreciate everything you've done for me. I can't even do this if it weren't for you. I was so humble and appreciative, but I took the job. Then 2 weeks after I go to 1310, I get a call from a very, very famous program director who used to do the Tom Joyner show in Chicago and come back and do the Tom Joyner show here in Dallas. I don't know if you're old enough to remember that
I remember
show.
Tom Joyner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So Michael Spears, who had a very distinct voice, he became the program director at KRLD, which, if you're in talk radio at that time, now KRLD is the premier station you want to be
Right.
at. It has a gigantic signal. They could hear it in Austin. And he goes, Larry, this is Michael Spears. I've been a fan of yours for all these years. I want to get you over to KRLD. I call him. I go, why didn't you call me 2 weeks ago? I just signed a contract with 1310. And he goes, if anything ever changes, call me, Larry. I kid you not. The next week, I'm on an airplane. I don't, back then you didn't have Wi-Fi or any need to
Right.
check your phone. I check my messages, and Michael Spears goes, Larry, you're not going to believe this. We just bought 1310. We now own it. So now I get to have you on. He goes, I get to have you on KRLD. The story gets even better. So I'm doing, and just you remember my show, I didn't have a lot of guests. I was just
Right.
the caller was my guest. Like, the caller was more important to me than the guest.
Right.
And so I did 2 hours from from 8 to 10. No, I'm sorry, from 9 to 11. I had an hour to go from Dallas to Arlington and go do 2 hours on KRLD every Saturday. For years, this happened. But then, guess who buys 1310? KLIF guys,
Carolina.
the ones that told me that it wouldn't even work to begin with. So then they have to sit down with me because
Right.
they don't want me to do both stations. One's a
Yeah.
competitor of theirs, and they hated having to pay me out of the contract because I had 2 years left. And so I said, guys, I love you, but I'm going to KRLD. And they had to pay me out of the contract, and no hard feelings. Years later, Dan, it was bittersweet for Dan because he felt like he did discover me and gave me my first shot, which he did. And then I spent 34 years on radio, and then I met Russ. I forget how I met Russ, but he had me as a guest. He honestly, his career was a fascinating success story. He couldn't buy a job in this town. I'm serious. He couldn't buy a job. He had this sort of not the greatest voice. He was a little flippant, a little arrogant, but they gave him this show on, I forget what the station, I think it was 97.9. It started at midnight from like 12 to 2. And
Yeah.
to his credit, man, he created a formula. Do you know that they made so much money off his
Oh,
show?
yeah.
A
Yeah.
ton. And we had fun. I mean, he knew that I never took him too seriously, and that was part of the shtick, was to let him sort of goof on me. In fact, I don't know if you know this, he used to call me
You
Horseface.
got
He
horse
said,
face.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So you'd go to their website, and there was a little cartoon horse with my head going
Yep.
back and forth on the website, which by the way, that gave me great publicity. And
Right.
then
Right.
one day, my mother calls into the show and says, Russ, stop calling my son Horseface. And it's funny. Anyways, we always had fun. But as you know as well as I do, I felt like he wasn't going to live a long life. He was very self-destructive, and it's just
Yeah.
sort of sad. I think that Russ was just a very lonely human being. And then when he got arrested, he got arrested in my gym in
Right.
South Lake, in my
Yep.
gym.
In your
And
gym.
and you know what? Because my dad was in prison. I still in this country believe that you are innocent until proven guilty. He found out who his true friends were during that period of time. And I said, Russ, I'm not here to judge you. I'm gonna support you. I hope that you get through this. I know that you will. And of course, he did get through it. He might have been guilty of what they accused him of, but yeah, it was just sad. It's sort of a sad story at the end of the day. He made a lot of money. I mean,
Yeah.
he was pretty successful financially and
Yeah.
didn't spend it on much. But anyways, that's sort of probably more information than you care to hear. But I thought I'd
No,
share that.
my mom played radio contests whenever I was a kid. My dad went to work and my mom stayed at home. We had 3 different phone lines in the house. she would have different radio stations going throughout the day, KVIL, the Oasis,
Oh, how
KLIF.
funny.
I
That's
mean,
great.
just anything. So I grew up going to radio shows, like I at least once a week I was somewhere eating pizza with Ron Chapman, and
Oh,
Ron Chapman never knew I existed, but I was still there. And so radio was just I was having this conversation yesterday, like whenever I connected with you, and I thought it was fascinating that you come up on my connection list. And I was just having this conversation about the impact that radio was having in the 80s and the 90s and the early it's kind of stopped in the early 2000s, but radio used to mean so much, and there was so much talk, and there was so much listenership here in Dallas that, gosh, it really just meant something, and now everything is just so automated, and
what,
content is just kinda spewed out.
so my brother Alan has a company called Keto Med,
Yeah,
and he sells it on a TV show called Know the Cause. And we both have known Doug Kaufman for decades, and so he and I discussed this a lot because I had my infomercial was pretty huge, was on radio, had my own TV show. Traditional media still does work, but you're going to be catering to an older demographic.
right,
Yeah, yeah. Not a lot of people in their 60s, 70s listen to podcasts, but today it's podcasts, which people don't realize. Radio that I did was live, your live radio, much different than a podcast.
right.
And because it's real time, I think my brothers always kid around that if social media had been around when in the 90s, my following would have been enormous because my infomercial played in 5 different countries constantly, and being on radio and being on all the modalities that I use. But yeah, it's the world has changed tremendously. In fact, I spoke to an infomercial guy who worked on my show in the days, who was the marketing behind it, and he said, yeah, traditional media still is going to work, but not as it used to. But they buy in. These guys, they buy into the influencers now. These influencers can be extremely effective. So it's just interesting. So tell me though, because you have a fascinating story yourself. What was the turning point? How'd you go from trainer to investor, entrepreneur? What was the
Yeah,
the, the, the turning point in
yeah,
your life?
there were a couple of shifts. Um, Whenever my daughter started walking, and I've said it on, like, so many different interviews, but when my daughter started walking, that was like the eye-opening moment, the first paradigm shift that I had, where I realized that she was just kinda going through this baby program and watching us. And so, eventually she starts repeating everything that we say, right? And she's just acting out behaviors that we're doing, and whenever she was doing this, I weighed like 405 pounds. I would go between 365 and 415 pounds, just depending on the day and how many, burgers and everything that I ate that week. I came from a very, very obese family, and, my dad was a bodybuilder, and even though, like, I would yo-yo all throughout my entire life of working out, starving myself, running, whatever it was, uh, right around this time, not only was my daughter was she going through all these changes, but I started going through changes. I hired a personal trainer. After going through a bunch of really bad trainers, because as well as I do, there's a lot of trainers that are in the industry that have been athletes their entire life and they look good, but they don't know anything about how to change a person. And so, like I got into training, like I had lost about 100 pounds. I realized that I wanted to be a trainer. I got, a nutritionist certification, got my license to train, and
Where, where,
and
where
man,
were you? Where were you training people
so I
primarily?
started I started at a small town in Georgia in Moultrie at an Anytime Fitness. And then I came here to Dallas. And when I got here to Dallas, I was scared that I was not gonna have as much of an impact as I did on this town that had, like, 1 gym, you know? And I started working out at LA Fitness, the one in Las Colinas. And whenever I started there, they had 22 trainers on the clock, 22 trainers in their system. And within 2 weeks, they went down to nine because I changed the level of training. All of my clients started immediately getting results within weeks, as opposed to they had been working out with these trainers for some of them years and they weren't getting anywhere. So, eventually they asked me to get into sales. They had me selling my story, while knowing I couldn't put these people on my schedule. And so I was selling my story to sell training and then passing off the client to somebody who wasn't going to get them results. So I eventually left. Then I started training clients out of Mustang Park Recreation Center in Irving, like right on the cusp of Irving and Las Colinas. You can see the 635 interchange and that 24-hour fitness at Olympus from the rec center. It butts right up to 635. So I started training clients there. And then, man, some of my people needed some cardio, so I started meeting up with them on Saturday mornings. And then it turned into a boot camp. And then before you knew it, we had 20 people, then 30 people, then 50 people. And then we would have like, I mean, like people would come with cameras and like film us running and doing boot camps and stuff. And I eventually got on the news. Um, I started talking to a few gyms about my weight loss story. And then people were like, "Oh, you should write a book." I started writing. I wrote a book. I started taking care of my daughter full time. She was being abused. I got custody of her.
How old is she now?
13. I got custody of her when she was about 3. And so then it was like work from home dad from that point. I left the gym and I started helping business owners. I started flipping websites. I call it flipping websites. I was meeting business owners that needed websites. I had a development team. I wrote my first book or two, and then I started helping people write books. Eventually, I met a broker and I built a website for him, and then he got me into investments, you know. And man, that was probably 8 or 9 years ago. And then I guess in around 2015, I started my own software company. Got into the angel investment realm in 2018. I kind of unofficially retired. My mom had a stroke. And so my life at that time just became about family. And then, in 2020, I started making a comeback and decided that I was going to turn smarter into this big thing. And then, of course, COVID happened, everything shut down. I lost my mom in 2021, and that was in January. She got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and
Oh,
they gave her
that's
8 months to
awful.
fight,
Sorry about that.
and she was gone in 4 days. And
Oh,
so I spent
an
the rest
awful
of
cancer.
2021 beating myself up about all the conversations that I was supposed to have with her that I never got a chance to have. And so 2021, I kind of checked out. And then by spring or so of 2022, I started realizing that I was living this really small life and that I had bigger things that I needed to do. Um, I started working on myself again. I had gotten back up to 345 pounds. Started going to the gym, started building my portfolio back up. Um, and then in early 2021, I got COVID. It got into my intestines. I went septic.
Oh man.
Uh, I got vertigo um, for about 3 weeks straight. I was throwing up if I looked at anything. I eventually had to walk on a cane for a couple of months, I mean, like, it got me. And so it was around April of this year, just about 4 months ago, whenever I finally started working on myself again, I decided to I was listening to Tony Robbins and Ed Mylett on a podcast when I was laying in the hospital. I was at Baylor in Plano, and, and Tony said, if you have that one regret, if you have one thing that you're gonna regret for the rest, or if you're on your deathbed and you look back and there's that one thing, And for me, it was building this company. And the main reason is because there was a bigger reason for it. I never wanted to build this company for money. I wanted to build this company because the company is a domino that starts the footprint or it starts the I don't know, man. It's like the domino that starts what I have planned to do to help the world, the things that I have in my heart that I know that I was put here for. And so it's, whenever I had this like heart surgery back in 2012 in this brief moment where I thought I passed on, and I saw my daughter not having me, and that scared the shit out of me. And I guess it brought me back. But whenever COVID happened at the beginning of the year, I just saw God was showing me that I have this ability to bring people together and that I'm here to bring people together to help the planet in a much bigger way. And that if I had passed away, then there was going to be this huge chance for the world, you know, to change that wasn't going to happen because I wasn't going to be here. And so that was what pushed me to fight, to like fight through COVID and stand back up and come back and, and do what I'm working on now. And so, yeah, it sounds really funny. Like I'm sitting over here in my little apartment in Dallas talking about my plans for changing the world. But, you know as well as I do, man, it starts small. It really starts small. And not only does it start small, but it really comes with conversations like this. You put a post up that said relationships and memories, brother, and that's it. And so
Yeah.
now at 40 years old, I'm realizing that I'm never going to have a bad day again. I've learned to have moments that I don't necessarily like, but I've never let it go past that moment. And so even now with my health, like I'm not bodybuilding and I'm not trying to kill myself the way I was in the gym 10 or 12 years ago when I was a trainer because my life is different. It was a little bit easier for me to stay in shape when I was getting paid. But right now, what my focus is making sure that I walk every day. So, like, I do this little 3.5 mile walk in one of the White Rock trails over here in my neighborhood. It's got a bunch of hills. I make sure that I get that 3.5 miles a day. If I can get to the gym 3 or 4 times a week with my busy ass schedule, then I'm happy. But the most important thing is I'm not stressing right now because what I say, whenever I say COVID almost killed me at the beginning of the year, I think stress almost killed me at the beginning of the year, and COVID just kind of caught a ride.